Chapter 6. Invasion. From her spot on the wall, even through the steady downpour, Venari could see movement in the forest. At first, whoever it was appeared to be trying to move undetected, but stealth had been abandoned now. There was no mistaking it. Red Fern was surrounded. "Sound the alarm!" Venari shouted, making the two young soldiers next to her jump out of their skin. Even though they'd been tasked with looking at the same section of forest she had, they hadn't seen the movement. Perhaps they just missed it, or perhaps they were inept. If they all came out of this alive, these two would begin further training, or disciplinary action. In the distance, the bell from the bell tower rang out, alerting all who lived in Red Fern. Venari could imagine the townsfolk arming themselves with makeshift weapons and barricading their doors and windows. Activity erupted around her as arrows were aimed but not yet fired at enemies many had not yet seen. Containers of hot sand and boiling water were prepared, ready to be poured on those foolhardy enough to try and climb in. Weapons were gripped tightly, and prayers were muttered. For many, the reality of the situation was starting to set in. The bravado Venari had witnessed earlier was replaced with stoicism. A silence fell over the wall, and the waiting began. Venari looked out into the woods of waiting again. The invaders must have seen the activity on the wall and heard the bell. After all, who could miss it? As they now peeled away from their hiding places, revealing themselves, Venari's breath caught in her throat. There were so many of them. Hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers fell into rank at the foot of the wall, all wearing the deep blue and purple colours of Moonwitch. "We're screwed," she thought, but her face was a mask of confidence. The sound from the bells made Ivanor's ears ring. Even from this distance, they were loud enough to wake the dead. Their song told the people of Red Fern about the attack, but they also told Ivanor it would soon be time for him to go home. He didn't care if Moonwitch was successful in taking over the town. All he cared about was going back to the place he hadn't seen since he was a small boy. Well, he had seen it once quite recently, but he'd been invading it with Red Fern's forces at the time. As Moonwitch's army got into formation down below, Ivanor couldn't help but smile. It would all be over soon, one way or another. Mildred Rutland awoke with a start at the sound of the bells. Red Fern wasn't attacked often. People generally didn't dare to strike against the Queen on her home turf, but the folks within its walls knew what those bells meant. After she shook Stanley awake, Stanley was one of those people who could sleep through anything, she jumped out of bed and scurried out of the bedroom in time to see her son getting ready to leave. "I have to go, Ma," he said, pulling the hood of his cloak up over his helmet. The visor was open so she could still see his eyes. He looked every inch the warrior, but he was still Mildred's little boy. "I know," she said, smiling sadly. As proud as she was that her son was fighting to protect them all, she still wanted to keep him with her. She wanted to keep him safe. "Take care." "I'll do my best," Angus replied as he left the house. "Fire a wheel!" Venari shouted, her voice already hoarse and her throat sore. "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Arrows shot out over the wall. Some found their target. Others didn't. Every arrow that missed appeared to mean that one more Moonwitch soldier got another step closer to their city. A couple of dozen Moonwitch soldiers were now out of reach of the arrows and were scaling the wall. "Send the hot sand over! Get 'em with the boiling water! We can't let them get in!" she yelled, knowing that there would be deaths on both sides if the enemy force was able to infiltrate their defences. Venari turned to the two young soldiers at her side. "I need you both to bring hot sand over to this side as well. Their soldiers may not have ventured this far yet, but they soon will." We need to be ready. Be quick." "Yes, sir," they said in unison before racing away. As soon as they left, the first Moonwitch soldiers started to climb the wall in Vimelk's section. This part of the battle had been so predictable, but she still felt unprepared. One wrong move and it's all over, she thought, thinking that statement was true for both sides. The two young soldiers returned, struggling to carry the container of hot sand between them. "Tip it over," she said. "We've got company already." Grunting, they lifted the container and balanced it precariously on the top of the wall. It was then that one of the soldiers paused. Perhaps the reality of what he was about to do was beginning to sink in. "What are you waiting for?" she yelled. "Tip it!" After a small amount of hesitation, the young soldiers tipped the burning hot sand over. Coltol Winnow held on to the wall with all his might. He hated his commanding officer for giving him this duty. It felt like he was heading straight into certain death. As certain as that death might have been, denying the order would have been equally as bad. Coltol had been caught between a rock and a hard place. He reached up, trying to find another place for his fingers to grip. The wall was rough and cut into his skin. It seemed strange to him that the tiny discomfort of cuts in his skin would be his main focus at that moment. But that was the case. Or at least, it was, until he heard two words that made his blood freeze in his veins. "Tip it!" Coltol looked up in time to see something fall from the top of the wall. It could only be a couple of things. Hot sand or boiling water. Neither idea filled him with any joy or confidence. He swallowed and weighed up his options. He could let go of the wall and fall to his death, or he could get hit by burning hot sand or boiling water and then let go of the wall and fall to his death. Coltol laughed without humour and let go. Closing his eyes, he waited for the ground to meet his back. Just before most of the bones in his body smashed and his skull exploded, he heard his commander shout, "We're through the gates!" "Shit!" Vimelk shouted as the enemy army forced its way through the gates and into Red Fern. Down below, she could hear her counterpart shouting orders. She could hear fighting. She could hear death. It was everywhere already. "We can still stop some of them," she said to the soldiers next to her. "Keep that hot sand coming. Pour it on their heads." She turned to see one of the young soldiers heading towards the exit. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked. "Where do you think you're going?" Vimelk asked him. Ivanor refused to answer, instead choosing to keep walking. His boots clunked against the stone steps, and his heart beat like a war drum in his chest. He was doing the right thing, wasn't he? Even above the din of the battle that raged all around, Ivanor heard another set of footsteps hammering the steps above him. He was being followed. Getting caught now wasn't an option. He had to keep going. Increasing his pace, he almost fell down the next set of steps. "Stop!" Vimelk called. "That's an order!" The exit was in sight. He just had a few more steps to descend. Knowing this, Vimelk increased her speed and barged past him, knocking him into the stone wall. Pain screamed in his arm and shoulder following the collision. "Stop!" she shouted again, blocking his way out. "You can't abandon your post! You can't abandon your people!" Ivanor paused. There was only one way out of this. "My people," he said, drawing his sword. "These are not my people." "What do you mean? Of course they're your people." Ivanor's mouth set in a firm line as he prepared himself for what he had to do. Even though she was from Red Fern, he held no ill will towards Vimelk. But she was in his way now. "Wait," she said, taking in the look on Ivanor's face. "You're one of them, aren't you? I don't know how you did it, but you let them in, didn't you?" Nodding, Ivanor felt relief as the truth was finally revealed. "I let a few in last night," he replied. seeing no harm in telling her the plan now it had been set in motion. There was no stopping it now. They would have been the ones to open the gates. But why? You've lived here all your life. Some of my life, he said, correcting her. I was born a Moonwitch. But you have friends here, she said, trying to reason with him, trying to change his mind. But there was no chance of redemption. By now, his actions had probably claimed the lives of dozens, if not more. If he didn't leave now, he'd be executed come morning. I'm sorry, he said, and he was in a way. He wasn't sure which set of people meant more to him at that moment, the family he'd been born into in Moonwitch, or the family he'd made in Red Fern. Either way, it didn't matter. He had to leave. Wheels had already been set in motion, and even though there were many things he couldn't decide on, he knew he didn't want to be burnt at the stake or beheaded. Without any further hesitation, he swung his sword, aiming for Vimelk's neck. He would have gone for another, less vital body part, but his commanding officer was too well armoured. Ironically, the amount of armour she wore would be the thing to kill her. Not stopping to see if he completely decapitated her, Ivanor ran. The streets were crowded, full of fighters, screams and corpses. Angus pushed through, aiming for the area near the wall. That's where his friend Ivanor would be. That's where he would make his stand. The new power pulsing through his body meant he could run and fight his way towards his target with ease. How could something like this be bad? It was then that he began to find the answers to that question. Red Fern was still Red Fern, but it was different now. The shadows were longer and darker, deeper. The townsfolk were not alone. Freezing in place, Angus took in his surroundings. Hideous creatures looked at him from every conceivable direction. Goblins hung out in doorways. Tiny monstrosities that could only be described as imps danced in and out of windows. Several sets of glowing eyes stared at him from the depths of alleyways. Those eyes scared him the most. Not knowing what they belonged to left him with an unease he'd never experienced before. The world had changed. Or perhaps it had always been this way, and now he was just seeing it for what it really was. Either way, it wasn't safe. Angus felt like he'd never be safe again. A goblin watched him from the doorway of the butcher's shop, fixing him in its stare. It looked a lot like Pigby, but its eyes were different. One was yellow, while one was a deep, dark red. Something about that eye made Angus's bowels want to loosen, but he managed to hold it together. That eye had seen terrible things and depraved acts. Angus knew all that without even speaking a word to the creature. All Angus wanted to do was find Ivanor, but his legs refused to move. The muscles locked in place. Moving from the doorway, the goblin looked to the darkening sky and let out a high-pitched screech. It reminded Angus of the sounds some birds of prey made. He'd heard plenty of them while marching. On more than one occasion, he'd been convinced that one of those winged beasts would swoop down and swipe him from the crowd. Out of the corner of his eye, Angus saw movement. More goblins, at least a dozen of them, were drawing close. The goblin from the butcher's shop doorway grinned and stepped towards him. Back off! His legs still didn't want to move, not even a little. To Angus's surprise, the goblin paused. Leaning in Angus's direction, the goblin sniffed at him. As you wish, the creature said. If it was possible, its grin widened even more. Turning to the others, it said, This one's changing. Not worth our time. What? You're tainted, darling. The goblin's voice was little more than a venomous hiss. You're just like us, boy. Just like us. With that, the goblin with the strange eye left, no doubt going to find food elsewhere. Angus didn't want to think about who would fill the creature's belly. Did they feed on someone every night? It was a wonder there was anyone left in Red Fern. Once that goblin was out of sight, Angus tried to move, only to find that his legs were still frozen. Behind him, something laughed. The people rushing either to or from the battle paid no attention to either Angus or the giggler. Without turning around, Angus knew it was one of the goblins. Its vile laugh was just like Pigby's. "What do you want?"
"Hungry,"
it replied. "You heard your friend," Angus said, still unable to turn and see the creature. "I'm tainted," the goblin said, moving around to face him.
"Maybe. Maybe not."
Moving close so it was only an inch or so away from his torso, the goblin sniffed deeply.
"You certainly smell different,"
it said before stepping back.
"Come closer. Take off your helmet. Let me get a good look at you."
It curled a finger, beckoning Angus towards it. Unable to control his body, Angus removed his helmet and bent at the waist until his face was level with the goblin's head. Before his eyes, the goblin's mouth opened wide, and it kept getting wider, growing unnaturally. Its whole head stretched, and Angus was sure he could hear the muscle and flesh in its head stretch and snap to accommodate the huge maw. The creature emitted a screech, much like the goblin with the strange eyes, before clamping its huge jaws on Angus's head. Uneven teeth dug into his neck. Warm blood, his blood, whirled around each puncture wound before dripping onto the ground below. Angus then experienced the bizarre sensation of having his head sucked. His mind thought back to the stories he'd heard as a child, the ones usually saved for the dead of night, only to be told by candlelight or over the warming flames of a campfire. The ones that spoke of goblins and their taste for human flesh, their love of crunching human bones, and, what Angus had always found most disturbing of all, their addiction for sucking on brains. Angus would have been quite happy to go through his whole life without finding out all those points were true. The truth was a bitch. Struggling to breathe, his nose and mouth started to fill with goblin mucus. A force built up around his eyes, leading him to believe they'd be sucked free of their sockets at any moment. The pressure tightened, and Angus knew that at any moment the creature was going to end the relationship his head had with his body. It was a shame, as Angus was rather fond of that coupling. Closing his eyes, he waited for the inevitable. But the inevitable didn't come. Angus heard a whoosh and a thunk. Although his head remained in the creature's mouth, and its teeth were still firmly lodged in his neck, the force behind the bite disappeared in an instant. The sucking stopped. Glad to be breathing clean air again after pulling himself free, Angus looked up to see Pigby standing in front of him, a bloodied axe in his hands and a murderous grin slapped across his face. Where did that little fucker get an axe from? Wasn't it already dangerous enough? What happened? You saved me.
"You seem surprised."
"But you're a goblin," Angus said.
"What? And that means I can't do a good deed?"
Pigby said, pretending to be offended.
"I'll just leave you to it next time. I'm sure my goblin brethren will find you delicious. Maybe I'll find you delicious."
Would the goblin save him just to kill him itself? Angus took a step back, and the goblin watched him.
"Oh, calm down,"
Pigby said.
"I'm not going to eat you. If I was going to do that, you'd be in my belly already."
"So what then?"
"So what then what?"
The goblin raised an eyebrow. Angus noticed the creature still held the axe in its hands. The weapon was almost twice its height, but it carried the object with ease. "Why did you help me?" Pigby seemed to consider this for a moment, and finally lowered the axe.
"Well, it looks like you had a job to do. I don't want Red Fern to fall either. Get to it."
"Right. Thanks," Angus said, surprise filling him.
"Well, there's that. And we kind of know each other now. You've got to look out for your friends.
We're not friends, Angus said, thinking back to the body the goblin had killed and devoured earlier. He still planned to avenge that poor man, but that would have to be at another time. The goblin didn't seem hurt or offended by Angus's words. In fact, its smile grew wider.
Fair enough. But you do have somewhere to be, don't you? Don't you have an invasion to stop?
Unsure if the goblin was teasing him, Angus grunted and pushed the creature aside. As he walked away, he heard Pigby call out to him.
Before you go getting any ideas, just remember that you shouldn't drink that vial. Things will happen. Unchangeable things. You'll be a creep forever.
Angus replied with an angry-sounding grunt.
Although,
Pigby said as Angus made to turn away,
I can't say I understand what you plan to do over there. You're not strong. You're not really an experienced soldier. I mean, what can you do to help?
Choosing to ignore the creature's taunts, Angus stormed away, heading towards the wall, heading towards Ivanor. Chapter 7. Betrayal. A stitch formed in Angus's side as he ran. He'd thought his stint in the army had made him fit, leaving him in top physical condition. But he'd never had to run this fast before, and there had never been so much at stake. The streets passed by in a blur, leaving Angus barely enough time to see the crimson carnage that surrounded him on all sides. But he saw enough, and there were a multitude of monsters around, taking advantage of the panic. Angus could have done without seeing that. Perhaps there were downsides to drinking the content of the vial after all. At last, the wall was in sight. Quickening his pace and dismissing the ache in his legs, Angus pushed onward. Someone knocked into him as they fought and fled away from their attacker. Angus landed on the ground with a heavy thud, the wind forced out of him. He tried to stand, only to be pushed back down again. This time, he fell back harder, his head ricocheting off something hard and solid. For a moment, Angus saw stars. At least it made a change from seeing monsters. While he waited for his vision to return to normal, Angus looked up at the night sky. The real stars appeared to be so calm and serene, completely oblivious to the bloodshed happening down below. Around him, screams rang out. Forcing his body to move, he sat up and looked around. To his surprise, Ivanor was standing a few feet away. But Angus didn't trust his eyes. His eyes had to be lying. His eyes told him he'd just seen Ivanor attack a fellow member of the Queen's Guard. After making sure Angus was out of the way, Pigby gripped the blood-coated axe with both hands and continued on his way. The goblin had promised his guilderm Wiley, and by extension the Queen, that dark work would be done that night. None of Pigby's employers had specified what that dark work should entail, but Pigby didn't need to be micromanaged. Dark work was where the goblin excelled. Pigby knew what would be most efficient here. The fire in the living room was doing little to keep her warm, the blood in her veins growing colder by the second. Mildred shivered and rubbed the tops of her arms, wondering what was going on outside the perceived safety of their home. As soon as Angus had slammed the door behind him, Stanley had woken, and together they built the fire and huddled beside it. While Stanley was the strong, stoic, silent type, Mildred couldn't keep still. She paced back and forth so much she was sure she was about to wear a hole through the floorboards. "He'll be fine," Stanley said after a while. Having known her husband for most of her life, she knew Stanley would have been building up to those words for some time. They were meant to be encouraging words, the kind of thing that should calm her down. But tonight they felt like a lie. How could Stanley know Angus would be fine? He hadn't been outside. He didn't know what terrors waited for them beyond their front door. Anything could be out there. And Mildred fully expected the worst. "He's a soldier now," Stanley said, after some more moments had passed and neither of them had said anything more. By now, Mildred must have walked a mile stepping back and forth in front of the fire. "He knows what to do. They teach him how to fight and survive." "He's only been on one campaign," Mildred countered before biting at a fingernail. "He's hardly a seasoned fighter." "Everyone has to start somewhere. And look at him. Before he went away, he was nowt but a boy. Now look at him. He's a man. A warrior." "If he's such a warrior, why do you want him to keep working at the shop? Why not get him to join the guard full time? You're full of it sometimes, Stan." Even as she said the words, she regretted them. Mildred was worried for her son and it was making her snap. She always said things she regretted when she was at her wit's end. She watched as her husband physically seemed to bite his own tongue, saving himself from speaking words he'd regret too. "We're both worried," he said, after a short time, his voice quiet. He got up and stood in front of her, wrapping her in his arms. "We just have to have a little faith in him. You're right. I do want to keep him at the shop. But it isn't because I don't think he's a good soldier. I want him there because it's safe there. I know it's a stupid idea, and I know I should probably let him spread his wings, but I don't want to." "Me neither," Mildred said. "I do think you should tell him that when he comes back. He thinks you think he's pretty useless." Stanley replied, returning back to his usual silence, listening to the crackling of the fire. They stood in their embrace for a while, before Stanley went back to his chair and Mildred continued her pacing. Every now and then they shared a glance. That one look provided them with enough comfort to keep them sustained until it was time for the next look. They could keep going like this all night if they had to, although they both hoped that peace would arrive long before that. So far they'd been fortunate. That is, of course, assuming you count having their only child go out to fight an invading force fortunate. Aside from that, the battle had failed to reach this deep into Red Fern so far. Most of the action still seemed to be happening around the wall, with only the odd shout being heard from where Mildred and Stanley were. Their worry was not for their own well-being, it was for their sons. After all, they were safe enough where they were. It wouldn't be long until they realised their safety was just an illusion. Not quite believing that she was still alive, Fimelk thought back over the last few moments. She'd been sure the young soldier had cut her head clean off, but it seemed her luck was still holding strong. Even if he hadn't decapitated her, the wound must be pretty severe, especially if the pain was anything to go by. Fimelk tried to lift her hand to touch the gaping wound on her neck, but nothing happened. Concentrating, she tried again. Still nothing happened. This was bad. Why couldn't she move her arm? Maybe it was broken, injured when she fell. She tried to move the other arm, but reached the same outcome. As the panic started to rise in her chest, she kicked out with her legs. Or at least she tried to. Unable to move any part of her body apart from her face, Fimelk screamed. The scream came out as a pitiful gurgle. She had never felt so powerless. She'd never felt so vulnerable. The worst part was, she could hear the fight continuing around her, but there was nothing she could do to play her part. She'd failed her family. She'd failed Red Fern. and she'd failed her queen. Deep down, she knew there was no coming back from this. Sooner or later, she'd expire right there at the foot of the steps where the young soldier had left her. Someone would find her body eventually, but by then she'd be nothing but a useless slab of decaying meat. But who would find her? Would it be a member of the guard, or someone from Moonwich? Would the enemy prevail? She tried the gurgling scream again. The scream was a blend of frustration and grief. It was a wet mess of a noise, but Fimek prayed that someone would hear it over the sounds of a raging battle. And someone did. Mildred was mid-pace when she heard it. Her foot hovered over the bare floorboard below. Scratching. It sounded like the time rats had got into the food store. Moving slowly, as if that would enable her to hear better, Mildred lowered her foot to the floor. There was definitely scratching. It was louder now too. Those must be some big rats. "What's wrong?" Stanley asked. Mildred had grown accustomed to the silence, and now her husband's voice felt unnaturally loud. It seemed to reverberate through the air. "Can you hear that?" she asked, holding herself still again to listen properly. Stanley did the same, squinting at the fire as if it would help him focus. Maybe it did. After a short time, the noise came again. "Rats?" Stanley said. "That's what I was thinking." Mildred abandoned her pacing and grabbed the broom she kept propped up against the wall. Sometimes the mere sight of the broom was enough to scare the vermin away. "They would pick tonight, wouldn't they? Terrific timing." Stanley got to his feet. "I'll deal with it." "Really?" Stanley nodded. "I need to keep occupied." Taking the broom from his wife, Stanley walked cautiously into the kitchen. Unable to wait around and do nothing, Mildred followed him. He turned, giving her a questioning look. "What?" "I want to help," she said. "Fair enough," Stanley said. "Now, be quiet. I need to figure out exactly where the scratching is coming from." They both stood stock still, Mildred with her hands clasped together and Stanley with the broom tight in his grip. The scratches came again. "It's weird," Stanley said. "Now that we're in here, it sounds like the scratches are coming from outside." Mildred nodded in agreement. Rather than rats going after food, it sounded like something trying to get in. "I'll take a look outside," Stanley said, crossing the kitchen towards the door. "Wait," Mildred said as her husband's hand reached for the door handle. On any other night, she would have been right there opening the door with him. After all, it could be a lost dog looking for shelter, and the Rutlands weren't the kind to turn anyone, human or animal, away when they were in need. But tonight wasn't like other nights. Tonight, the town where they'd spent their whole lives was under attack. Mildred realised this could mean that someone was in trouble and could need their help, but she also felt dread. It could be someone needing their assistance, or it could be someone who wished them harm. Opening the door would be a mistake. "What is it?" Stanley asked when Mildred didn't finish her sentence. "I don't think we should open that door. It doesn't feel safe." Stanley looked at his wife's face and saw the worry etched there. She looked exhausted, and he was pretty sure he looked the same. "Okay," he said. "We'll leave it." A sigh of relief was just leaving her lips as Mildred heard a new sound. It was like someone picking a lock. Together, Mildred and Stanley watched as the door handle started to turn. "Angus?" Mildred called out, ever hopeful. The call was little more than a whisper. Somehow she knew it wasn't Angus coming home. Stanley lifted the broom higher as the door handle moved again. His knuckles turned white as the door creaked open. Mildred wasn't sure what she was expecting to see when the door opened fully. But she certainly wasn't expecting what they got. Nothing. There was no one or nothing there. "What in the gods?" she half muttered, taking a step towards the open door. Why would a door open by itself like that? Had a gust of wind caught it in the storm? And even if it was due to the storm, that didn't explain the scratches or the door handle turning. There was just no logical explanation for it. So Mildred's mind turned to the illogical ones, stories that her parents had told her and that she in turn had told Angus. Stories of monsters, ghosts and ghouls. She bit her lip, wondering if she should share her concerns with Stanley. "Something strange is afoot here," her husband said. "I don't like this at all." "Me neither," Mildred said. "I think I preferred it when I thought rats were eating us out of house and home." For a moment, her attempt at lightening the mood worked, and small smiles flashed across both their faces. But those smiles soon vanished when an axe floated through the open door. Still holding the broom, Stanley pushed Mildred behind him, his eyes never leaving the levitating axe. A drop of blood fell from the axe and splashed onto the kitchen floor. "Get back!" Stanley said, and Mildred wasn't sure if he was talking to her or the axe. Either way, she decided it was good advice. Keeping an eye on the axe and holding her husband's sleeve, she pulled him into the house. The axe rose higher and swung down at speed. Moving faster than Mildred had seen him move for years, Stanley pulled the broom up just in time. The axe smashed through it without slowing, but at least Mildred and Stanley were still intact. One half of the broom landed on the floor, leaving Stanley with a small, slightly sharp stick. It probably would have made a useful weapon, but Stanley had no idea where to aim it. How do you fight a floating axe? Swinging the makeshift weapon blindly, Stanley managed to make contact with something. Mildred heard the wooden stick knock against something solid. "Can you see anything?" Stanley asked. Mildred looked around the space surrounding the axe. There was nothing there. Nothing at all. "No," she replied. Are you sure?" Stanley asked. For the first time since the floating axe had entered their home, Mildred tore her gaze from it and looked at her husband. His eyes were wide in fear, and his teeth were chattering. In his hands, the remaining part of the broom shook. "I'm sure," Mildred replied. "Why? What do you see?" I can't believe it." "What is it?" Mildred asked. Stanley's fear was contagious. She could feel it invading her and creeping through her body. She could feel it infecting her blood and freezing her muscles. From the looks of him, Stanley was unable to move either. No, this can't be real," he said. "What can't?" "This isn't real," he uttered, as the axe swung across and separated his head from his neck. Mildred felt its heat as warm blood cascaded over her face. Her blood remained icy cold. "Wait!" Angus called as Ivanhoe raced past him. Getting to his feet, he looked his friend in the eye. Ivanhoe looked uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere than face to face with his comrade. "What do you want?" he snapped. "What the fuck? Why did you stab him? He was one of our guys." Ivanhoe looked over to the body of the soldier. Blood had poured around the puncture wound his sword had left, but the man had stopped moving. He'd stopped breathing too. He'd stopped doing anything. He was one of your guys. "What? What does that even mean?" "He belongs to Red Fern, just like you," Ivanhoe replied. "I don't, so I'm going home." "What the fuck are you talking about? Of course you belong here," Angus said. "I don't," Ivanhoe said, turning to walk away. "I never have. I'm going home. To Moonwitch." Ivanhoe walked away as fast as he could without breaking into a run. "Don't you walk away from me," Angus called after him. But Ivanhoe didn't react. He just kept going. The man he thought was his best friend was leaving him. He was also a traitor. He was the enemy. Cursing his former friend under his breath, Angus felt his anger starting to rise. Heat began to radiate from his pocket, increasing steadily, until he was sure it would burn through the fabric and then into his skin. Logic suggested the vial would be scalding to the touch, but Angus reached his hand into his pocket for it anyway. Ignoring the heat, his fingers closed around the small glass object. He held the vial up to his face and watched the blood bubble within. Anger pushed all thoughts of consequences from his mind. Blind with rage, he uncorked the vial and let its entire contents slide into his mouth and down his throat. Chapter 8. Creep. The tiny sips Angus had taken from the vial were nothing compared to this. The remaining contents filled his mouth and seemed to expand. Feeling both hot and cold at once, it sent a sensation that was part burn and part tingle throughout his mouth, over his tongue and down his throat. From there, he felt every inch of its journey deeper inside him. Instead of heading to his stomach, it roamed freely around his body, worming its way into every nook and cranny. It travelled through his veins and burrowed deep into his bones. Jolts of pain like lightning strikes shot through his jaw, his legs, his arms, and his heart. His head spun, but not in the way it did when he was in his cups. It spun literally, swivelling on his shoulders, ignoring everything that said this should be impossible. Shouts and screams surrounded him, but the sounds were far away. They felt unimportant. Angus's fists clenched and unclenched of their own accord. Once his head stopped spinning, he chanced to look at himself and gasped at what he saw. His fingers were covered in green scales, and his nails had hardened into vile claws. At first, he thought about trying to hide them from any onlookers, but a more pressing issue nagged at his mind. What else had changed? Stumbling, he moved over to the soldier Ivanor had dispatched and stared at his reflection in the pool of blood. For the most part, he still looked like himself, and his face was free of the scales that plagued his hands. But his eyes looked different. It was impossible to see their colour in the bloody puddle, but they appeared lighter, brighter. Okay, what else? He muttered, the reflection of his teeth catching his eye as he spoke. Those were not his teeth. They couldn't be. He paused and looked again. His tongue explored each and every one. There was no mistaking it. He had the teeth of a monster. Jagged and sharp, they put Pigby's gnashes to shame. So sharp they cut into his tongue, Angus could already imagine them plunging through warm flesh. Shaking his head in disgust, he tried to force the thought from his mind. This wasn't him. Or was it? Not wanting to be observed, Angus glanced left and right, searching the faces of those around him, human and otherwise. Most were engaged in fighting and not looking in his direction. But he knew that could change in an instant. The chances of being seen doing what he planned to do were high. But did it matter? He was powerful now. Somehow, he knew he was far more powerful than any of those around him. The thought pleased him. As he smiled, a tip from a particularly sharp tooth snagged against his lip. Hot blood ran down his chin. His tongue reached out to taste it. The flavour was good, but he knew the blood and flesh of another would taste better, perhaps even divine. Wasting no more time, he leant over the soldier's corpse and bit into his neck. The meat was already starting to cool, but it was still the best thing Angus had ever tasted. In fact, he couldn't imagine anything else tasting as good as this. He doubted the Queen ate this well. Blood coated his tongue and ran down his throat. His new teeth tore through the man's flesh like it was nothing. Angus took a few more delicious bites from the corpse before he became aware of the crowd forming around him. His wish to remain unobserved had not been granted. They had all seen him. An urge to flee flitted across his mind before vanishing forever. Fleeing was for the weak. Fleeing was something prey did, and Angus was a hunter. In no time at all, he had found himself at the top of the food chain. Revealing as many teeth as possible, Angus smiled at his audience. Some gasped. Some screamed. Some ran. One even fainted. Angus could only imagine how he looked to these people. Blood covered his face, and scales covered his hands. And who knew what else? He must have looked hideous. Part of him hoped they were all afraid. It was at that moment he realised just how much fear surrounded him. He could smell it. A soldier stepped forward from the rest of the crowd. Angus thought he recognised him as the poor chap who took a horse shit to the head during one of the many marches he'd undertaken recently. Angus tried to remember the man's name. It felt like it was on the tip of his tongue, but it was hard to concentrate when it was covered in crimson deliciousness. The soldier took Angus's silence as an invitation to come closer. Angus still couldn't remember the bloke's name, but it was clear he was an idiot. "What happened to you, Rutland?" the soldier asked. Angus's name clearly stuck in his mind. Shaking, the soldier pointed a sword at Angus's face. When Angus didn't answer, the soldier tried again. "Talk, Rutland! Speak fast or lose your head!" Since the soldier outranked him, there was a moment when Angus was about to follow the order. But then he stopped. He was no longer a mere foot soldier in the Queen's Guard. He was more than that. Embracing his new monstrous persona, he hissed at the soldier, sending spittle into his opponent's face. This elicited a high-pitched shriek from the other man, making him stagger backwards and drop his sword. The sound of the weapon clattering to the ground awoke something in Angus. Something deadly. All he felt was rage, blind and furious rage. It didn't matter what colour the soldiers around him wore. It didn't matter if they were loyal to Red Fern or Moonwitch. It didn't even matter if they were soldiers or not. They were all prey. With a noise that was part growl, part yell, he threw himself into the crowd. His teeth and nails were indiscriminate in whose blood they stole. They wanted it all. Angus wanted to bathe in the stuff. Feeling nothing but blind fury, he committed himself to the attack. He chewed on flesh, enjoying its spongy texture between his jaws. Limbs were torn from torsos. Screams were cut short. Soon, there was silence, only broken by Angus's own heavy breathing. Around him, bodies littered the ground. The rage started to fade, and Angus looked at his hands. They were coated in the blood of other people. How many lives had he claimed in the last few moments? "What have I done?" he asked aloud. Staring in disbelief, he staggered away from the carnage. Had he really been responsible for all that? He'd killed during the raid on Moonwitch, but that had been different. He'd been following orders. This was something else. There was no one to pin the blame on but himself. Not caring who saw him, he sobbed. Chest heaving, the sounds were wretched and animal, the product of a creature in pain. Guilt tore at him, its force making him want to drop to the ground. This was all his fault. Except, maybe it wasn't. Sure, he'd murdered those people, but he wouldn't have done it if he hadn't drunk the contents of the vial. And he wouldn't have done that if Red Fern wasn't under attack. And of course, Red Fern wouldn't be under attack if they hadn't been betrayed. In Angus's mind, that meant only one thing. The weight of the blame belonged to Ivanor, and Angus was determined to make sure that debt was paid in full. He just needed to get close enough to his former friend, a man he'd thought of as his brother. Driven by vengeance, anger, and raw animal instinct, Angus searched the pile of corpses, unsure of what he was looking for until he saw Moonwitch's colours on a fallen soldier. This was the perfect disguise. Not caring who saw him, Angus loomed over the dead man, and his new form started to work in his favour. With no conscious thought leading the action, Angus set about using his claws to remove the dead man's face. It came away far easier than he could ever have imagined. Not that he'd ever given such a task much thought. Holding the flap of skin aloft, he examined it in the moonlight. "Put it on," a voice that wasn't his but was, said in his head. "Wear it." Such an idea was ludicrous. Wearing the face would certainly make a statement, But he wouldn't pass as being the man he'd killed. He'd be a grotesque parody. Nobody would be fooled, especially not Ivanor. He hesitated, and the fleshy mask quivered in his grip.
Wear it,
his internal voice said again. It was more insistent this time. Who was he to argue? Not realising he was holding his breath, Angus brought the stolen face up to his own, feeling the cooling blood against his cheeks. The sensation wasn't unpleasant, but there was no time to revel in it. Muscles shifted under his own skin. Something inside him reached for the meat mask, pulling it closer, making it fit flawlessly over his skull. Maybe this would work after all. Angus smiled, the action feeling alien on his new face. Helpless, Fimalk lay against the stone steps as her life bled away. The battle around her felt like it was happening miles away, an event she was to play no part in. Figures ran past her, some wearing Red Fern's colours, some wearing those of Moonwitch. None of them paid her any attention. She understood. She was a lost cause. She may not be dead yet, but she soon would. One of the passing figures returned to stand over her, and Fimalk waited a moment for them to disappear again. When they didn't move, Fimalk tried to speak. "Are you real?" she asked, her voice little more than a wet whimper. The idea that anyone could be focusing on her when there was so much else going on seemed impossible. "Of course," the figure said. The voice seemed familiar, and Fimalk tried to get her eyes to focus. The figure's form remained a mystery, but Fimalk supposed it really didn't matter if they were there to harm her or not. She'd be dead soon anyway. Blood gurgled in Fimalk's throat. "Isn't there something else you need to be doing? We're being invaded. Let me die in peace." Instead of coming out clearly, the words were a ragged mess of grunts and syllables. It would be a miracle if Fimalk's mysterious companion understood even one of them. The figure sighed, and Fimalk imagined whoever it was rolling their eyes. "Do you want my help or not?" "There's no saving me," Fimalk said, choking on the words. These ones were at least comprehensible. "For fuck's sake! I didn't have you pegged as a quitter," the figure said. "The Queen seems to think you're useful though, so do you want my help or not? Or shall I just tell Queen Elspeth I arrived too late to do anything?" Help coming from the Queen was not something that could be ignored. Nor was it something that could be taken lightly. It always came at a price, and usually a high one. But Fimalk was in no position to barter. The figure's identity was still a mystery, their face hidden behind a mask. Fimalk knew a handful of people who wore masks in Red Fern, and all of them had close ties with the Queen. From what she could tell, the offer of help was genuine, and time was running out. She could worry about the true cost later. "Yes," Fimalk croaked. "Please help." Those words were crystal clear. "A good choice," Wiley said, removing a vial from her pocket. The small container looked a lot like the one she'd been shown by Angus. Little did the young soldier know how common they really were, and nor did he know how useful they were. "Drink this." Wiley tipped the vial against Fimalk's slightly parted lips. The woman didn't even question what it was. She was probably past the point in caring. As Wiley watched, Fimalk's eyelids closed slowly. Everything was going according to plan. Queen Elspeth would be pleased. While she waited for the woman to pass out again, Wiley wondered how she was going to drag Fimalk through the streets and towards the apothecary. Chapter 9. Blame. The rage shifted as he walked, and the reality of what he'd just done started to bother Angus. What was he becoming? Ignoring the violence that seemed to litter every pocket of Red Fern's streets, Angus thought about earlier, when he caught Pigby in the act of eating that beggar. At the time, he'd been repulsed by the creature's actions, but now he was pretty much doing the same thing himself. How in the gods did it come to this? Speaking of gods, Would Mortfell, the god of death, devour his soul when the time came? Was he still worthy of a good afterlife? After all, it wasn't his fault. It was the Vile's fault. More than that, it was Ivanor's fault. Now we just needed to find him. Without knowing where he was going, Angus walked with purpose. Angus walked through the city's streets, his sword forgotten at his side. He had no need for such a weapon now. Angus was the weapon. All nervousness and self-doubt had disappeared. Underneath his borrowed face, he didn't even flinch as he strolled by fights between soldiers. He didn't blink when he wandered by goblins. If anything, he fancied they became nervous when they caught a glimpse of him. What kind of monster was he? A monster capable of scaring monsters? Soldiers from both sides fought or lay injured wherever he looked. Finding Ivanor in this was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. But he kept walking. Without any conscious thought, Angus sniffed the air. On it, he could smell and taste fear, panic, blood, and death. He sniffed again, taking a deeper breath, and caught a familiar scent. It seemed impossible, but memories flooded into him of waking up in a shared tent with that scent. He could remember marching with that scent. It was a smell he'd never noticed before, but now it was as familiar to him as the smell of his mother's cooking. It was Ivanor's scent. Angus followed his nose. Shards of glass, splinters of wood, and various other unidentified debris crunched underfoot as Angus approached Palestone Castle. Buildings surrounded him in various states of invasion. Some had been broken into, some were on fire, some housed the screams of Red Fern's inhabitants. Somewhere nearby, a goblin chewed on a human bone. There was no way of knowing which side the unfortunate soul had been fighting for. A group of Moonwitch soldiers lurked outside the main entrance to Palestone Castle, having crossed the moat with no small amount of bloodshed. One of them kicked against the thick wooden doors to the keep as he uttered what Angus believed to be a swear word. Their frustration told Angus that at least the castle hadn't been breached. Fires lit up the night, and he was able to see the faces of each of the invaders. Most he did not recognise, but there was one face he knew well. At some point, Ivanor must have found time to remove his Red Fern armour, as his breastplate now proudly displayed Moonwitch's crescent moon. Angus sneered. This fresh betrayal sent a brand new wave of anger through his veins. "Ah, brother!" Ivanor called to him. For a second, Angus paused at the friendly greeting. Did Ivanor think he'd forgive him so easily? He was about to say as much when he remembered he was wearing another man's face. "I like the disguise, but I don't think it's necessary anymore," Ivanor said as Angus drew closer. Once again, these words made him pause, and his confusion must have been clear as Ivanor spoke again and pointed at Angus's torso. "The Red Fern armour. It's a nice touch, but there's no need for stealth now. Even I've changed." "That you have," Angus muttered. There was no disagreement there. If Ivanor had heard him, he didn't react. Instead, he turned to the other soldiers. "We should get started," he said. With that, the other soldiers broke off in different directions to attend to tasks happening elsewhere. "I didn't realise we'd be teamed up, Filbert," Ivanor said, smiling. Unsure of how Filbert spoke, Angus simply nodded, hoping that would be enough. "You're quiet. Nothing at all like I remember you. When we were kids, you'd never shut up." Angus said nothing. "I guess things change, don't they?" Ivanor said, apparently uncomfortable in the silence. It was strange, as Ivanor and Angus had shared many comfortable silences when marching. They'd also shared jokes and stories like only friends do. To Angus, it all seemed like it happened a lifetime ago. An awkward laugh from Ivanor disturbed his memories. "I suppose home has changed, hasn't it? I mean, I know I saw it briefly recently, but I expect it's very different in peacetime." Home. Realising Ivanor wasn't that familiar with Filbert, at least not anymore, Angus decided to speak. "Yeah, home. Ivanhoe moved towards him and raised an eyebrow. "Are you all right, Filbert? You're looking a little pale. Are you sick?" Ivanhoe squinted as if that would help to reveal his companion's secrets. "Maybe you're not keen on the sight of blood. I know the feeling. I was the same way for a while. I got over it though. I had to." "Oh, the blood doesn't bother me." Angus moved closer so they were almost nose to nose. For the first time since Angus had arrived, Ivanhoe looked more than a little unnerved. Ivanhoe tried to take a step back, but Angus grabbed hold of his shoulders. Panic flashed across the traitor's features. "What's going on?" Allowing his jagged teeth to show beyond his mask, Angus smiled. "Don't you recognise me, brother?" Blood drained from Ivanhoe's face, his skin taking on the same pallor as the moon hanging in the night sky. "Filbert," he whispered, but there was no conviction in it. It was as if he knew the man in front of him wasn't his comrade from Moonwich. The teeth were more than enough of a giveaway. "Not quite," Angus replied. "Filbert's dead." After taking a moment to stop his bottom lip from trembling, Ivanhoe spoke again. "What are you?" To his credit, he didn't scream, and for whatever reason he wasn't trying to run. Perhaps he already knew trying to escape would be futile. "What am I? That's a very good question. To be honest, I have no idea," Angus began as he stared into Ivanhoe's wide eyes. Even during the raid at Moonwich, the man hadn't looked scared. Angus supposed that back then there wasn't any need for Ivanhoe to be afraid. At least, not really. Just as he was about to reveal his identity and unleash his punishment, the familiar contours of Ivanhoe's face gave him pause. This was the face of his friend, his best friend. Sure, he'd betrayed the city and the Queen, but their friendship had to mean something, didn't it? While retaining eye contact, Angus let go of Ivanhoe's shoulders. Even though he was no longer restrained, the other man didn't think to run. "It's me. Angus." "No, that's not possible. Why do you look like Filbert?" As he spoke, the ability to move returned to Ivanhoe, and he took a few measured steps away from the young man claiming to be Angus. "I'm changing." Angus held up a scaled and clawed hand, as if this would go some way in explaining what was happening. "I guess we're both different now. You're a traitor, and I'm this. I'm powerful." "Why'd you have Filbert's face?" The smile on Angus's lips stretched. "He wasn't using it anymore." "You killed him," Ivanhoe said. It wasn't a question, he already knew the answer. "Just like you've killed Red Fern soldiers. It goes with the territory." Angus neglected to mention he'd just killed anyone within arm's reach once the rage took hold of him. "I'm sorry I had to come to this." To Angus's surprise, his former friend did look genuinely remorseful. "But it was always going to be this way. It was why I was placed here. There was no other way my time here was going to end." "And end it will," Angus said, backhanding Ivanhoe across the face and slicing the soldier's cheek open with his claws. Regaining his composure, Ivanhoe sucked in a breath and spat blood on the ground between them. The traitorous soldier raised his hands in a defensive position and fixed his stare on Angus. "I don't know who you are now. You're not Filbert, even though you wear his face. You say you're Angus, but your purple eyes and monstrous features tell me that's a lie too. You may have been one or both of my friends, but now you are neither. You are an oddity, a monster, a parasite that needs removing before it can claim more hosts." Even though he fully intended to kill Ivanhoe for his betrayal, those words stung. There was a level of truth in them Angus didn't want to see. Since drinking the contents of the vial, he'd changed. With each subtle change, and at times not so subtle, he lost a little more of himself. Who would he be by the time the sun rose? What kind of monster would he become? Would he even be able to stand in the daylight? Would killing his friend send him over an edge he wouldn't climb back from? Questions ran through his mind faster than he could process them, making him hesitate. Ivanhoe used that to his advantage. After serving with the man during the Moonwich invasion, Angus knew he was a talented fighter. But with Angus's new changes, he thought he could beat him with ease. He neglected to realise that Ivanor had needed to hold back in Moonwitch. The man hadn't wanted to cause too much damage to his hometown, to his people. Now there was nothing to hold Ivanor back. Ivanor sent a jab to Angus's face with his right hand. Despite being distracted, Angus deftly moved out of the fist's path, grunted in frustration. Ivanor jumped back and raised his hands to protect his face from any attack Angus might send his way. Foregoing claws and teeth, Angus returned the punch, making contact with the side of Ivanor's head. Further punches were exchanged, both men appearing to enjoy the fight, and neither making a move to end it. Perhaps Angus didn't have to kill Ivanor. Perhaps he could just capture him and turn him over. Maybe he didn't have to fully transform into whatever he was becoming. Angus was expecting another punch to land on him, but it didn't come. Instead, the tough sole of a leather boot smashed against his chin, sending his teeth into the inside of his cheek and into his tongue. The taste of his own blood enraged him, but he could do nothing as he plummeted to the ground. Air forced its way out of his lungs upon impact. Stars broke out across his vision. This was no longer the friendly punch-up Angus had started to believe it to be. Ivanor had changed the rules. Dragging himself along the ground, Angus closed the gap between him and his opponent. "Not so tough now, are you?" he heard Ivanor say. But he said nothing in return. The fall to the ground had taken all the air and words from him. Trembling with rage rather than fear, he reached for Ivanor's boot. "Look at you. Pathetic," Ivanor said as he kicked at Angus's hand. A smile curled at Angus's lips as he clamped Ivanor's ankle with both hands. The man had just enough time to make a noise of surprise before Angus used his newfound strength to throw the man against the castle's closed doors. There was a satisfying thud as Ivanor came into contact with the wood. Now it was his turn to be winded on the ground. There was nothing for it. Angus was going to become a monster, and as far as he was concerned, it was all still Ivanor's fault. He made a grab for Ivanor's ankle again and lifted him up. It seemed as if the man weighed next to nothing. Groans came from Ivanor's barely conscious form. Each little noise of pain and discomfort pleased Angus in ways he could never explain. Eager to hear more of those sounds, he swung Ivanor against the thick wooden doors again. The soldier hit them with such a force they rattled on their large iron hinges. Bruises started to form on Ivanor's face, and there was a nasty-looking cut on his temple. The sight of the other man's blood excited Angus almost as much as the cries of pain did. With rage, vengeance and bloodlust burning through his heart, Angus strode over to his opponent's prone form and lifted him by the head. He stared at the cuts and bruises for a while, as if he were a healer, and was examining them. But Ivanor would never be fixed. Breathing made ragged with excitement, Angus held on to Ivanor's head with both hands, staring into the man's eyes. It looked like the injured man was about to say something, but Angus never heard his words. Using both hands, he pushed Ivanor's head, his inhuman strength shattering the skull. His hands plunged into gunk and brain matter. One glassy, sightless eye continued to stare back, while the other had been squished into nothing but goo. Proud of his kill, Angus ripped the ruined head from Ivanor's shoulders and held it aloft. Victory was his.